The evening rain hammered against the windows of the Silver Creek Ranch house as Marcus Sterling reviewed the monthly reports spread across his mahogany desk. At 35, he had built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, transforming his father's struggling homestead into an empire worth millions. The warm glow of the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the leather-bound ledgers that documented his success. A soft knocking interrupted his concentration. Marcus frowned, glancing at the grandfather clock in the corner. 9:30 was an unusual time for visitors, especially during such a fierce storm. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had retired hours ago, and his ranch hands were either in town or settled in the bunkhouse for the night. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. Marcus set down his pen and walked toward the front door, his boots echoing against the polished hardwood floors. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a small figure hunched against the storm. When he opened the door, Marcus found himself looking down at a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22. Her dark hair was plastered to her head by the rain, and her simple cotton dress clung to her slender frame. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to stay warm. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I need help." Marcus stepped aside immediately, ushering her into the warmth of his home. "Good Lord, you're soaked through. Come in, come in." He closed the door firmly against the wind and rain, then turned to study his unexpected guest. The young woman stood dripping on his Persian rug, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent entryway. Marcus noticed she was beautiful despite her bedraggled appearance, with delicate features and expressive green eyes that held a depth of worry far beyond her years. "What's your name?" Marcus asked gently, maintaining his distance so as not to frighten her further. "Sarah," she replied, then quickly added, "Sarah Mitchell." The name meant nothing to Marcus, though he knew most families in the area. "Where did you come from in this weather?" "The nearest town is 15 miles away." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I walked from Millfield. I had nowhere else to go. 15 miles through a thunderstorm." Marcus felt a surge of concern for this young woman's desperation. What could drive someone to make such a treacherous journey on foot? "You must be frozen," he said, already moving toward the closet near the front door. "Let me get you something warm." He pulled out a thick wool coat, one that had belonged to his late father. "Here, put this on." As Marcus held out the coat, Sarah took a step backward. "I can't be seen," she whispered urgently. "Please keep my secret." The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Marcus lowered the coat, studying her face more carefully. There was something haunted about her expression, a terror that spoke of serious trouble. "Sarah, you're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever has happened, you don't have to face it alone." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't understand. If anyone finds out I'm here, if anyone knows where I've gone." Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Marcus had seen enough of life to recognize when someone was running from danger. His protective instincts, honed by years of taking care of his land, and the people who worked it, kicked into full gear. "No one will know," he assured her, unfolding his coat and wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "You have my word." The wool coat enveloped Sarah's small frame, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. She pulled it tightly around herself, finally allowing some of the tension to leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice thick with relief and exhaustion. Marcus guided her toward the living room, where the fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth. He settled her in the leather armchair closest to the flames, then moved to pour her a cup of coffee from the pot that Mrs. Patterson always kept warm on the side table. "Drink this," he said, pressing the warm mug into her cold hands. "It'll help warm you up." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic for warmth. Marcus noticed her hands were scratched and dirty, evidence of her difficult journey through the storm. "When did you last eat?" he asked, noting the hollow look in her cheeks. "Yesterday morning," Sarah admitted reluctantly. Marcus's jaw tightened. Whatever situation had driven this young woman to his door was clearly serious. He excused himself to the kitchen, returning minutes later with a plate of leftover roast beef, fresh bread, and cheese. "Eat," he instructed, setting the food on the small table beside her chair. "We can talk when you've had something in your stomach." Sarah ate slowly at first, as if afraid the food might disappear. Then, with increasing hunger as her body remembered its needs, Marcus watched from across the room, giving her space while staying close enough to offer comfort if needed. As she ate, Marcus found himself studying this mysterious young woman who had appeared on his doorstep. Her speech suggested education despite her simple clothes, and there was a refinement to her mannerisms that spoke of a genteel upbringing. Yet here she was, alone and afraid, seeking refuge from some unnamed threat. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the warm circle of firelight, a different kind of tension was building. Marcus felt an unexpected protectiveness toward this stranger, a desire to shield her from whatever had driven her to such desperate measures. When Sarah finally set down her fork, some color had returned to her cheeks. She looked up at Marcus with eyes that held both gratitude and lingering fear. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied. "But I think it's time you told me what you're running from." Sarah's hands tightened on the coat wrapped around her shoulders. For a long moment, she stared into the fire, as if gathering courage for what she needed to say. "My stepfather," she finally whispered. "He wants to marry me off to his business partner, a man old enough to be my grandfather, with a reputation for—" She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus felt anger flare in his chest. Forced marriages were not uncommon in some circles, but the thought of this young woman being sold off like property made his blood boil. "Where's your mother in all this?" he asked gently. "Dead," Sarah replied flatly. "She passed 2 years ago. My stepfather controls everything now. The house, the money, my future. He says if I don't marry Mr. Hartwell, he'll turn me out with nothing." The pieces were starting to fall into place. Marcus could imagine the impossible choice Sarah had faced: marry a man she feared and despised, or lose everything and everyone she'd ever known. "So you chose a third option," Marcus said with admiration. "You ran." Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I have nowhere to go. No money, no family who would stand up to my stepfather. I heard people in town talking about you, saying you were a fair man who helped people in trouble." Marcus felt the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders. This young woman had risked everything on the hope that a stranger might show her kindness. He wouldn't let her down. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said firmly. "No one will force you into anything while you're under my protection." The relief on Sarah's face was immediate and overwhelming. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Marcus moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. "Hey," he said softly. "You're safe now. I give you my word." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, searching his face for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her, because she nodded and managed a tremulous smile. "I promise I won't be any trouble," she said. "I can work, earn my keep. I'm good with horses, and I can cook and clean." Marcus shook his head. "You're not a servant, Sarah. You're a guest in my home, and you'll be treated as such." As the fire burned low and the storm began to subside, Marcus found himself making plans for Sarah's safety and comfort. He would give her the guest room upstairs, ensure she had proper clothes and everything she needed. Most importantly, he would protect her secret and help her figure out what came next. What Marcus didn't expect was how profoundly Sarah's presence would change his own carefully ordered life. As he watched her finally relax in the warmth and safety of his home, he felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct that went beyond simple kindness. The young woman who had appeared out of the storm was about to turn his world upside down, though neither of them knew it yet. Sarah woke the next morning in a bed softer than any she had ever known. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains onto walls papered in gentle blue roses. This wasn't her small, sparse room at her stepfather's house. Then, memory flooded back. The storm, the desperate walk, and Marcus Sterling's unexpected kindness. She sat up carefully, wincing at the soreness in her legs from the long journey. On the chair beside the bed, she found a simple but well-made dress in forest green, along with undergarments and stockings that looked to be her size. A note in masculine handwriting read, "These belong to my late sister. I hope they fit. Join me for breakfast when you're ready. MS." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Sarah's eyes. When had anyone last shown her such consideration? Certainly not in the 2 years since her mother's death, when her stepfather had made it clear she was nothing more than a burden to be disposed of at the first opportunity. After washing in the basin of warm water that had been left for her, Sarah dressed in the borrowed clothes. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her slight frame. She brushed her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, then made her way downstairs. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee guided her to a sunny kitchen where Marcus stood at the stove, expertly flipping eggs in a cast iron skillet. He had traded his formal evening clothes for work pants and a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Sarah found herself studying the way he moved, confident and capable, like a man comfortable in his own skin. "Good morning," Marcus said, turning to smile at her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, then blushed at her own honesty. "Thank you for the dress. It's beautiful." Marcus's expression grew momentarily sad. "My sister Emma would be glad to know it's being put to good use. She passed 5 years ago in a riding accident." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said softly. "Emma would have liked you," Marcus replied, turning back to the stove. She had a soft spot for strays and lost causes. Sarah wasn't sure if she should be offended by being compared to a stray, but there was such warmth in Marcus's voice that she found herself smiling instead. "Sit," Marcus instructed, gesturing to the wooden table set with simple pottery plates. "Mrs. Patterson doesn't come in until afternoon on Sundays, so you're stuck with my cooking." The breakfast was simple but delicious: eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits, and strong coffee. Sarah ate slowly, savoring both the food and the comfortable silence. It had been so long since she'd felt safe enough to simply enjoy a meal. "What happens now?" she asked when they had both finished eating. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. "That depends on what you want. You can't go back to your stepfather, obviously. Do you have any other family? Friends who might take you in?" Sarah shook her head. "My mother's relatives all live back east, and I haven't heard from them since the funeral. As for friends," she trailed off, remembering how quickly her so-called friends had abandoned her when her stepfather made it clear he disapproved of most of her associations. "There are options," Marcus said gently. "I have business connections in Denver and San Francisco. I could arrange a position for you, governess, companion to a wealthy lady, that sort of thing." The offer was generous, but Sarah felt her heart sink. Another life in service, dependent on the whims of strangers. It would be better than marriage to Hartwell, certainly, but still a form of captivity. "I see," she said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Or you could stay here." Sarah's head snapped up. "What? I mean it," Marcus continued, warming to the idea. "This is a big ranch with lots of work. You said you're good with horses. I could use help with the training program. Emma used to handle that side of things before she died." The offer was so unexpected that Sarah could only stare at him. "You barely know me. I could be a thief, a liar, anything." "Could you?" Marcus asked with a slight smile. "Because you seem pretty honest to me." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. Marcus's expression immediately grew alert as he moved to the window. "Someone's coming," he said grimly. 3 riders. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "It's them. It has to be." Marcus was already moving, his demeanor shifting from relaxed host to protective guardian. "Go upstairs," he ordered quietly. "Stay away from the windows, and Don't come down until I call for you. But what if they dash, Sarah? Marcus's voice was firm but reassuring. I told you last night that you were safe here. Nothing has changed. Sarah nodded and hurried upstairs, but she couldn't resist peering through the curtains of the guest room window. 3 men on horseback were approaching the house. Her stepfather, Richard Mitchell, his business partner Harold Hartwell, and Hartwell's son Thomas, who served as his father's enforcer for less savory business dealings. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Marcus step out onto the front porch, projecting an air of casual confidence despite being outnumbered 3-1. Even from her hiding place, she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Gentlemen," Marcus called out in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "What brings you to Silver Creek so early on a Sunday?" Richard Mitchell dismounted, his face flushed with anger and exertion. He was a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and a permanent scowl that had only deepened since gaining control of his late wife's estate. "My stepdaughter ran away 2 nights ago," Mitchell said without preamble. "We have reason to believe she might have come this way." "I see," Marcus replied evenly. "And what makes you think that?" "Don't play games with me, Sterling," Harold Hartwell interjected, his gravelly voice carrying a threat. He was an older man with cold gray eyes and hands that looked more suited to violence than business. "The girl was supposed to marry me yesterday. Instead, she vanished like a thief in the night." "Perhaps she changed her mind," Marcus suggested mildly. Thomas Hartwell, a younger version of his father, but with an added layer of cruelty in his features, urged his horse closer to the porch. "We tracked her trail this far before the storm washed it out. She's here, isn't she?" Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the wall beside the window. These men terrified her in ways she could barely articulate. Her stepfather was driven by greed and social climbing. Harold Hartwell was known throughout the county for his ruthless business practices and rumored connections to less legal enterprises. But Thomas was perhaps the worst, a man who enjoyed intimidating those weaker than himself. "I haven't seen any young ladies lately," Marcus said, his tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension. "But you're welcome to check with my neighbors. Maybe try the Stevens place down the road." "We're checking here first," Mitchell declared, starting toward the porch steps. Marcus stepped forward, effectively blocking the man's path. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." The change in Marcus's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah could see it in the way he held himself, the quiet authority in his voice. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You can't stop us from searching," Thomas Hartwell blustered, his hand moving to rest on the grip of the pistol at his hip. "Actually, I can," Marcus replied calmly. "This is private property, and you have no legal authority here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance from what they probably assumed would be a simple intimidation. "Sterling," Harold Hartwell said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "you don't want to make an enemy of me. I have a long reach and a longer memory." "Is that a threat, Hartwell?" Marcus asked, and Sarah could hear steel beneath the quiet words. "It's a fact," the older man replied. "I know things about everyone in this county. Secrets that could ruin a man's reputation, destroy his business." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. Would he fold under the pressure? Would he decide that harboring a runaway wasn't worth the risk to his own interests? "You know what I think, Hartwell?" Marcus finally said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I think you're full of hot air. I think you've gotten so used to bullying people weaker than yourself that you've forgotten what it's like to face someone who isn't afraid of you." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see the fury building in the faces of all 3 men below. "You'll regret this," Mitchell sputtered. "When we find Sarah, and we will find her, I'll make sure everyone knows you obstructed our search. People will talk." "Let them talk," Marcus said with a shrug. "I've been the subject of gossip before." It was Thomas Hartwell who finally lost his temper completely. "Enough of this," he snarled, spurring his horse forward. "We're searching this place whether you like it or not." Marcus moved faster than Sarah would have thought possible. One moment he was standing casually on his porch. The next he had stepped down and grabbed the bridle of Thomas's horse, bringing the animal to an abrupt halt. "Get off my land," Marcus said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah shiver even from her hiding place upstairs. For a moment, the tableau held, Marcus staring up at Thomas with quiet intensity, the younger man's hand still hovering over his gun, the other two riders watching tensely from their mounts. Then Harold Hartwell spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of intimidation and violence. "This isn't over, Sterling. The girl belongs to us, and we'll have her back, one way or another." Marcus released the horse's bridle and stepped back, his hands loose at his sides, but his body coiled with readiness. "If you come onto my property again without an invitation, you won't be leaving on horseback. Are we clear?" The threat was unmistakable, and even Thomas Hartwell seemed to recognize that he was facing a man who wouldn't hesitate to back up his words with action. Richard Mitchell was the first to break, turning his horse away from the confrontation. "Come on," he said to his companions. "We're wasting time here. She's probably halfway to Denver by now." The three men rode away, but not before Harold Hartwell turned in his saddle to call back one final threat. "This isn't finished, Sterling. I always collect what's owed to me." Sarah remained at the window until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then hurried downstairs to find Marcus standing in his kitchen, methodically loading bullets into a Winchester rifle. "Are you all right?" she asked anxiously. Marcus looked up, his expression grim. "For now. But you heard what they said. They're not giving up." Sarah felt guilt wash over her. "I should leave. I should never have involved you in this." "Don't even think about it," Marcus said firmly, setting the rifle aside. "Those men showed their true colors today. I wouldn't turn a dog over to them, let alone a young woman. But they threatened you. Your business, your reputation." Marcus moved closer, his eyes intense. "Sarah, look at me. Do I look like a man who backs down for bullies?" She studied his face, the strong jaw, the determined eyes, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from every pore. "No," she admitted softly. "Then, trust me when I say we'll figure this out together." As Sarah looked into Marcus's eyes, she felt something shift inside her chest. This man had stood up to three dangerous adversaries without hesitation, risking his own safety to protect a woman he barely knew. It was a level of honor and courage she had never encountered before. What she didn't realize was that Marcus was experiencing his own moment of clarity. Watching Sarah's fear, seeing her vulnerability and strength in equal measure, had awakened something protective and profound in his heart. This was no longer simply about offering shelter to someone in need. This was about something much more complicated and much more dangerous to them both. The days that followed the confrontation fell into a careful routine. Marcus had been true to his word about giving Sarah work with the horses, and she threw herself into the task with grateful determination. The Silver Creek Ranch was home to some of the finest quarter horses in the territory, and Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for working with the more difficult animals. "She's got magic in her hands," old Jake Morrison, the head horse trainer, told Marcus as they watched Sarah gentle a particularly stubborn mare. "Haven't seen anything like it since Miss Emma was alive." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving Sarah's slight figure in the corral. She moved with quiet confidence among animals that had been giving the experienced cowboys trouble for weeks. There was something almost ethereal about the way she seemed to communicate with them, her voice a low murmur that somehow conveyed both authority and compassion. "Easy, girl," Sarah crooned to the chestnut mare, her hand extended palm up. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. You're safe now." The words sent a pang through Marcus's chest. He wondered if Sarah was talking to the horse or to herself. As the mare finally allowed Sarah to approach and stroke her neck, Marcus found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just 1 week. Sarah's presence had brought a vitality to the ranch house that he hadn't realized was missing. She had a quiet grace about her daily activities, whether she was helping Mrs. Patterson with the cooking or mending clothes by the fire in the evening. More troubling were his own reactions to her. Marcus had always been a man who kept his emotions well controlled, focusing his energies on building his business empire. He had planned to marry eventually, a sensible match with someone from his own social circle who could help expand his influence. Romance had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. But, watching Sarah laugh at something Jake had said, her face lighting up with genuine joy, Marcus felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with business sense or social advantage. "Boss!" Jake's voice broke into his reverie. "You want me to start the new Colts with Miss Sarah tomorrow?" "What?" Marcus shook his head, refocusing on the conversation. "Yes, that's fine. Whatever she thinks is best." Jake gave him a knowing look. "Seems like Miss Sarah thinks a lot of things are best around here lately." That evening, Marcus found Sarah on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl and gazing out at the sunset-painted mountains. She had taken to spending time there after dinner, and Marcus had begun timing his own evening routines to coincide with these quiet moments. "Beautiful night," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I never get tired of looking at those mountains," Sarah replied softly. "They make everything else seem so small in comparison." "Including our troubles?" Marcus asked. Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes thoughtful. "Do you really think they'll give up? My stepfather and the Hartwells?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation, but he knew Sarah deserved honesty. "No, I don't think they'll give up. Men like that don't like to be defied." Sarah nodded, having expected this answer. "Then, I'm putting you in danger by staying here. We've been over this, Sarah. I'm not afraid of them." "But you should be," Sarah said with quiet intensity. "You don't know what they're capable of." Thomas Hartwell once beat a man nearly to death because the man's dog wandered on a Hartwell property. His father paid off the sheriff to look the other way. Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, both at the injustice Sarah described and at the fear he could hear in her voice. "What about you, Sarah? What are you capable of?" The question seemed to surprise her. "I don't understand. You walked 15 miles through a thunderstorm rather than submit to a forced marriage. You're working with horses that intimidate grown men. You're stronger than you think." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. "Sometimes I feel strong," she admitted, "when I'm with the horses or when I'm talking with you like this. But then I remember what's waiting for me out there, and I feel like that scared girl again." Marcus reached over and covered her hand with his own. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, but neither pulled away. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said quietly. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, her heart racing. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." Before she could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful evening. But this time it was only one rider, and Marcus recognized the horse immediately. "It's Tom Bradley from town," he said, standing quickly. Tom was the telegraph operator, and he wouldn't be riding out this late unless something was seriously wrong. Tom pulled up at the porch, his horse lathered with sweat. "Marcus, thank God you're here. I've got bad news." "What is it?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected. "Harold Hartwell's been to see the sheriff. He's filed charges against Miss Sarah here for theft." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Theft? Of what?" Tom looked uncomfortable. "Hartwell claims you stole money and jewelry from your stepfather before you ran off. Says he's got witnesses." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of witnesses?" "The kind that money can buy," Tom replied grimly. "Sheriff's planning to ride out here tomorrow with a warrant." The three of them stood in the gathering darkness, the implications sinking in. If Sarah was arrested, she would be at the mercy of a legal system that Harold Hartwell had obviously already corrupted. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked. "Sheriff won't move until morning." "But, Marcus," Tom hesitated. "He's bringing deputies, and word is that Hartwell's men might be riding with him." After Tom left, Marcus and Sarah retreated to the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson was waiting with coffee and worried eyes. The older woman had taken to Sarah immediately, and her maternal instincts were clearly aroused by the threat to her young charge. "This is all my fault," Sarah said for the third time, pacing the kitchen floor. "I should have known they'd find a way to force the law to do their bidding." "Stop blaming yourself," Marcus said firmly. "We need to focus on solutions." "What solutions?" Sarah asked desperately. "If they have witnesses claiming I'm a thief, then we need to prove you're not," Marcus replied. "Mrs. Patterson, does Sarah have any proof of her identity? Letters from her mother, family documents, anything that might establish her character?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head sadly. "The poor thing came here with nothing but the clothes on her back." Marcus ran a hand through his dark hair, his mind racing. There had to be something they could do, some way to protect Sarah from this obvious frame-up. "There is one option," he said slowly, "but you're not going to like it." "What?" Sarah asked, willing to consider anything. "Marriage." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah stared at Marcus, her eyes wide with shock. "If we were married," Marcus continued, choosing his words carefully, "you would have legal protection. A wife can't testify against her husband, and, more importantly, you'd have the sterling name and reputation behind you." "That's—" Sarah struggled for words. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't ask you to dash." "You're not asking," Marcus interrupted. "I'm offering." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat diplomatically. "I'll just go check on the thing that needs checking," she said, making herself scarce. When they were alone, Sarah turned to face Marcus fully. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the question Marcus had been asking himself since the words left his mouth. Why was he willing to tie himself legally to a woman he had known for barely a week? Why was he prepared to make an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in the territory? "Because," he said quietly, "I can't stand the thought of them hurting you." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's heart skip. She had known Marcus Sterling for 7 days, but in that time she had seen more honor and genuine kindness than in years of her previous life. "It wouldn't be real," she said carefully. "I mean, it would be legally real, but we wouldn't, that is, you wouldn't expect. I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't willing to give," Marcus assured her. "It would be a marriage of protection, nothing more." Even as he said the words, Marcus knew he was lying to himself. His feelings for Sarah had moved far beyond simple protectiveness, but now wasn't the time to examine those complications. "We need a preacher," Sarah said, her practical mind beginning to work through the logistics. "Reverend Morrison in town. Jake's his nephew. He'd do it quietly, no questions asked." "And what about after? When this is all over?" Marcus met her eyes steadily. "Then, you be free to make your own choices. If you wanted to leave, to start over somewhere new with the protection of a sterling name, I'd help you do that." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive. All she saw was the same steady strength that had drawn her to his door in the storm. "All right," she said quietly. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." What neither of them wanted to acknowledge was how right the idea felt, how natural it seemed to bind their fates together. They told themselves it was practicality, a business arrangement designed to solve an immediate problem. But as Marcus took Sarah's hands in his to seal their agreement, both of them felt the lie in that simple touch. This was about much more than legal protection, though neither was quite ready to admit it. They had until dawn to make it official, and then they would face whatever consequences came from their choice. Together. The next morning would bring the sheriff and his deputies, but it would also bring a transformation neither Sarah nor Marcus had expected when she first appeared on his doorstep seeking shelter from the storm. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Silver Creek Ranch like a protective blanket as Marcus and Sarah made their way to the small chapel in town. Jake Morrison had ridden ahead to wake his uncle, Reverend Jonathan Morrison, explaining the urgent circumstances without revealing too many details. The old preacher had agreed to perform the ceremony immediately, asking no questions about the unusual timing. Sarah wore the best dress from Emma's collection, a simple but elegant navy blue with pearl buttons that caught the lamplight. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on braiding white ribbon through Sarah's dark hair, saying that every bride deserves something special on her wedding day, even under such circumstances. Marcus had chosen his best suit, the same one he wore to important business meetings, though his hands shook slightly as he fastened the silver cufflinks that had belonged to his father. The gravity of what they were doing was beginning to settle over him like a heavy coat. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sarah asked quietly as their buggy rolled through the sleeping streets of town. "Are you?" Marcus countered, glancing at her profile in the dim light. "No," Sarah said with more conviction than she felt. "You're saving my life. I'll never forget that." Something in her tone made Marcus's chest tighten, but before he could examine the feeling, they arrived at the small white chapel that served the town's spiritual needs. Reverend Morrison waited on the steps, fully dressed despite the early hour, his kind eyes taking in the young couple before him. "Marcus," the elderly minister said warmly, "and this must be the young lady Jake told me about." "Sarah Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "Soon to be Sarah Sterling." The Reverend replied with a gentle smile. "Shall we proceed?" The chapel was lit by only a few candles, casting dancing shadows on the simple wooden pews. Jake Morrison served as their witness, his weathered face solemn with the importance of the occasion. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on coming as well, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as she watched from the front row. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent joining lives together. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to witness the union of Marcus Sterling and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Sarah like a dream. She had imagined her wedding day countless times as a young girl, but never like this, a desperate gamble in the pre-dawn hours to escape a fate worse than any nightmare. Yet as she stood beside Marcus, feeling the strength of his presence, she found herself oddly calm. Marcus listened to the ceremony with growing amazement at how right this felt. He had expected to feel trapped, obligated, perhaps regretful. Instead, he felt a sense of completion, as if a piece of his life that had been missing was finally sliding into place. "Do you, Marcus, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Marcus turned to look at Sarah, struck by how beautiful she appeared in the candlelight. "I do," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Sarah, take Marcus to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Sarah met Marcus's dark eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the promise of protection and respect. "I do," she whispered. "The rings?" Reverend Morrison asked. Marcus reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. He had grabbed it from his father's old jewelry box before leaving the ranch, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand. "With this ring," Marcus said, sliding the band onto Sarah's finger, "I thee wed." Sarah looked down at the ring in amazement. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. She had no ring to give Marcus in return, but he shook his head slightly, indicating it didn't matter. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Morrison declared. "Marcus, you may kiss your bride." For a moment, neither of them moved. This part of the ceremony hadn't been discussed, and both were suddenly aware of the intimate nature of what they had just committed to. Then Marcus stepped closer, his hand gently cupping Sarah's face. "May I?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. When Marcus's lips touched hers, it was gentle and respectful, but there was an underlying current of something deeper that made Sarah's knees weak. The kiss lasted only a moment, but when they separated, both were slightly breathless. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," Reverend Morrison said warmly. "May God bless your union." As they signed the marriage certificate, making their union legal in the eyes of the law, Sarah caught sight of the first pale streaks of dawn through the chapel windows. Soon, the sheriff would arrive at Silver Creek Ranch with his warrant, but he would find a very different situation than the one Harold Hartwell had arranged for. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both Marcus and Sarah lost in their own thoughts about what they had just done. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers from the surrounding meadows. Mrs. Sterling, Marcus said suddenly, testing the sound of the name. Sarah looked at him with surprise. It sounds strange, doesn't it? Good strange, Marcus replied, then immediately wondered if he should have said something so revealing. When they arrived at the ranch, Mrs. Patterson had breakfast waiting, a more elaborate spread than usual, her way of acknowledging the significance of the morning. She had also set out coffee service in the good china, treating the newlyweds with the respect due to the occasion. "Well?" she asked anxiously as they entered the kitchen. "It's done," Marcus said simply, holding up the marriage certificate. "Sarah is now legally a Sterling." Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together in relief. "Thank the Lord. Now, when those men come around with their lies and accusations, they'll get a proper reception." As if summoned by her words, the sound of multiple horses approaching reached them through the kitchen windows. Marcus moved to look out, his jaw tightening at what he saw. "Sheriff Daniels," he reported, "along with 2 deputies and 3 other men I don't recognize." Sarah moved to the window beside him, her face paling as she recognized the additional riders. "Those are Hartwell's men. The one in the brown coat is Tom Garrett. He's the one who supposedly witnessed me stealing from my stepfather's house." Marcus felt anger burn in his chest at the thought of how carefully this trap had been laid. "Remember," he said quietly to Sarah, "you're Mrs. Sterling now. Hold your head up, and let me do the talking." The group of men dismounted in the yard, Sheriff Daniels leading the way to the front porch. Marcus stepped out to meet them, Sarah beside him, her chin raised with new confidence. "Morning, Marcus," Sheriff Daniels said, though his usual friendliness was strained. "I'm afraid I'm here on official business." "What kind of business would that be, Sheriff?" Marcus asked evenly. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Sarah Mitchell on charges of theft," the sheriff replied, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said calmly. "There's no Sarah Mitchell here." The sheriff frowned, clearly confused. "Now, Marcus, don't make this harder than it has to be. We know the girl's here." "You're looking for Sarah Mitchell," Marcus repeated. "I told you, there's no one here by that name." "Then, who's this?" demanded Tom Garrett, pointing rudely at Sarah. Marcus moved slightly, placing himself protectively between Sarah and the aggressive man. "This is my wife, Sarah Sterling. We were married this morning." The silence that followed was profound. Sheriff Daniels stared at them both, his mouth slightly open in surprise. Tom Garrett looked like he'd been slapped, while the other Hartwell men shifted nervously in their saddles. "Mary," Sheriff Daniels finally managed. "When?" "3 hours ago, by Reverend Morrison," Marcus replied. "Here's the certificate if you'd like to verify it." The sheriff took the document with hands that shook slightly, studying the official signatures and seal. It was clearly legitimate, filed properly according to territorial law. "This changes things," Sheriff Daniels said slowly. "The warrant is for Sarah Mitchell, not Sarah Sterling." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "And, as Mrs. Sterling is my wife, I'm sure you understand that any accusations against her are accusations against my family. My honor." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Everyone present knew that Marcus Sterling's word carried enormous weight in the county, and that attacking his reputation would be dangerous for anyone's future prospects. Tom Garrett spurred his horse forward, his face red with frustration. "This is just a trick. She's the same woman, no matter what name she's using." "Are you calling my wife a liar, Mr. Garrett?" Marcus asked quietly, and there was steel in his voice. "I'm saying she stole money and jewelry from Richard Mitchell's house." "Do you have any proof of this alleged theft?" Marcus continued. "Physical evidence? Witnesses other than yourself?" Garrett's face grew redder. "I saw her dash. You saw my wife, a member of one of the most respected families in this territory, commit a crime?" Marcus interrupted. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Garrett. I hope you're prepared to stand behind it in court, under oath, with the full weight of the Sterling name opposing you." For the first time, Uncertainty flickered in Garrett's eyes. He had been paid to lie about a powerless orphan girl, not to go up against one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Colorado Territory. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this matter requires further investigation," he said. "Given the change in circumstances, I think that would be wise," Marcus agreed. "And Sheriff, I'd be very careful about the quality of evidence you accept in any future proceedings. The Sterling name has always stood for integrity, and I won't tolerate anyone trying to damage that reputation with false accusations." The warning was clear. Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly, understanding that he was walking into political quicksand. Arresting the wife of Marcus Sterling based on the word of known criminals would be career suicide. "We'll be in touch," the sheriff said finally, folding the warrant and putting it away. "If any new evidence comes to light." As the men mounted their horses to leave, Tom Garrett turned back one last time. "This isn't over," he called out. "Mr. Hartwell doesn't give up easy." "Tell Mr. Hartwell," Marcus replied in a voice that carried across the yard, "that if he has a problem with my wife, he has a problem with me. And I suggest he consider very carefully whether that's a fight he wants to pick." The men rode away, leaving Marcus and Sarah standing together on the porch. For several moments, neither spoke, both processing what had just happened. "It worked," Sarah said finally, her voice filled with wonder. "They actually left." "For now," Marcus agreed, though his expression remained serious. "But Garrett was right about one thing. Hartwell won't give up easily. This is far from over." Sarah turned to look at her new husband, this man who had risked everything to protect her. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done." Marcus met her eyes, seeing gratitude there, but also something deeper, something that made his heart race despite the morning's tensions. "You don't owe me anything, Sarah," he said softly. "We're married now. Whatever comes next, we face it together." As they stood together in the morning sunlight, both Marcus and Sarah realized that their hasty marriage of convenience had created something neither had expected, a partnership that felt surprisingly natural, surprisingly right. But Harold Hartwell was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and the morning's victory was only the beginning of a much larger battle. 3 weeks had passed since the morning Sheriff Daniels rode away empty-handed, and life at Silver Creek Ranch had settled into a new rhythm. Sarah had officially moved her few belongings into the master bedroom, though she and Marcus maintained separate sleeping arrangements by unspoken agreement. The large room had a comfortable sitting area where Sarah spent her evenings reading while Marcus worked on ranch accounts at the desk by the window. The marriage that had begun as a desperate measure was evolving into something neither had anticipated. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying Marcus's company, looking forward to their conversations over dinner and their quiet moments on the front porch watching the sunset. Marcus, meanwhile, discovered that having someone to share his thoughts with made the burdens of running the ranch feel lighter. "You're different," Mrs. Patterson observed one afternoon as she and Sarah worked together in the kitchen garden. "Happier." Sarah paused in her weeding, considering the housekeeper's words. "I suppose I am," she admitted. "For the first time in years, I feel like I belong somewhere." "And Mr. Marcus is different, too," Mrs. Patterson continued with a knowing smile. "Haven't seen him this relaxed since before Miss Emma died." That evening, as Sarah and Marcus sat together on the porch, she found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, looking more like a working rancher than the wealthy businessman he was. "Penny for your thoughts," Marcus said, noticing her scrutiny. "I was thinking about what Mrs. Patterson said today," Sarah replied, "about how we've both changed." Marcus set down the ledger he had been reviewing. "Is that good or bad?" "Good, I think," Sarah said softly. "It's strange how natural this feels, considering how it started." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop interrupted their peaceful evening. Both tensed, months of wariness having taught them to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. Jake Morrison burst into the circle of porch light, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. "Marcus," he called out, dismounting quickly, "we got trouble." Big trouble. What is it? Marcus asked, standing immediately. Tom Bradley rode out from town to warn you. Harold Hartwell's bringing a federal marshal tomorrow morning. Claims he's got new evidence about Mrs. Sterling. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of evidence? Jake looked uncomfortable. Says he found the stolen jewelry in a pawn shop in Denver. Has witnesses saying you sold it there 2 days before your wedding. That's impossible, Sarah breathed. I was never in Denver. I've never been anywhere near Denver. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. This was more sophisticated than Hartwell's previous attempts. Federal marshals couldn't be intimidated or bought off as easily as local sheriffs. There's more, Jake continued reluctantly. Word is Hartwell's got himself a federal judge in his pocket. Judge who specializes in cases involving wealthy families. Apparently, he's convinced the judge that the Sterling name is being used to shield a common criminal. The implications hit both Marcus and Sarah simultaneously. If a federal judge had already decided Sarah was guilty, their marriage wouldn't provide the protection they had counted on. How long do we have? Marcus asked. Tom says they'll be here by noon tomorrow. 6 men, the marshal, 2 deputies, and 3 others Tom didn't recognize. After Jake left, Marcus and Sarah retreated to the kitchen where Mrs. Patterson waited with coffee and worried eyes. The older woman had overheard enough to understand the gravity of the situation. What are our options? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Marcus had been asking himself the same question. We could run, he said slowly. Take the back trails through the mountains, head for the California border. And then what? Sarah asked. Live as fugitives for the rest of our lives. It would be better than seeing you in Hartwell's hands, Marcus replied grimly. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with quiet determination. No, she said firmly. I won't run anymore. I won't let Hartwell destroy your life the way he's tried to destroy mine. Sarah Dash, listen to me, she interrupted, reaching across the table to take his hand. You've given me 3 weeks of happiness, 3 weeks of feeling like I had a real home. That's more than I ever expected to have. Your talking like this is over, Marcus said, his grip tightening on her hand. Maybe it is, Sarah replied softly. But I won't let you sacrifice everything you've built for me. The ranch, your reputation, your future, it's too much to ask. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Don't you understand? He said, his voice rough with emotion. None of that matters without you. The words hung in the air between them, a confession that changed everything. Sarah stared at Marcus's back, her heart pounding as she processed what he had just admitted. Marcus, she whispered. He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. I love you, Sarah. I think I've been falling in love with you since the first night you appeared on my doorstep. This marriage may have started as protection, but it became real for me somewhere along the way. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. You can't love me. You barely know me. I know that you're brave enough to walk through a thunderstorm rather than submit to a forced marriage. I know that you're gentle with wounded animals and frightened horses. I know that you make me laugh and that you listen when I talk about the ranch like it matters to you too. I know that you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I know that I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. Sarah stood and moved toward him, her own emotions finally breaking free. I love you too, she said, her voice barely audible. I try to keep my feelings separate because I thought this was temporary. But somewhere between learning to trust you and watching you face down armed men to protect me, I fell completely in love with you. When Marcus pulled her into his arms, the kiss they shared was nothing like the careful, respectful contact of their wedding ceremony. This was passionate and desperate, filled with weeks of suppressed longing and the fear that they might not have many moments like this left. Then, we fight, Marcus said when they finally separated. Whatever it takes, we fight this together. Ow, Sarah asked. You heard Jake. Hartwell has a federal judge convinced I'm guilty. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. What if we could prove the evidence was fabricated? Show that it was impossible for you to have been in Denver when Hartwell claims. How could we do that? Witnesses, Marcus said, warming to the idea. People who saw you here at the ranch during the time frame in question. Mrs. Patterson, Jake, the other ranch hands. If we can establish that you never left Silver Creek, Hartwell's story falls apart. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly listening from the corner, cleared her throat. There's something else, she said slowly. Something I maybe should have mentioned before. Both Marcus and Sarah turned to look at her. The day after you arrived, Miss Sarah, Mrs. Sterling, I had the doctor out to look at my arthritis. Dr. Henderson, he saw you working with the horses, asked who you were. I told him you were a friend of the family visiting from back east. Why didn't you mention this before? Marcus asked. Didn't seem important then, Mrs. Patterson replied. But if you need someone respectable to testify that, Mrs. Sterling was here on a specific date. Dr. Henderson keeps detailed records of all his visits. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Would he be willing to testify? Dr. Henderson's an honest man, Marcus said thoughtfully, and he doesn't like bullies any more than I do. If we explained the situation. They spent the rest of the evening planning their defense, gathering evidence, and preparing for the confrontation to come. By midnight, they had a list of 8 witnesses who could testify to Sarah's presence at Silver Creek during the time she was supposedly in Denver selling stolen goods. As they finally prepared for bed, both of them exhausted by the emotional revelations and strategic planning, Sarah caught Marcus's hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said softly, I want you to know that these 3 weeks with you have been the best of my life. Marcus lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. Tomorrow won't be the end, Sarah. I promise you that. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of beautiful day that seemed to mock the tension hanging over Silver Creek Ranch. Marcus and Sarah stood together on the front porch, flanked by Mrs. Patterson, Jake Morrison, and Dr. Henderson, who had arrived early to lend his support. At precisely noon, 6 riders appeared on the horizon. The federal marshal was easy to identify by his official bearing and the badge on his vest. Behind him rode 2 deputies and 3 men who looked more like hired guns than law enforcement officers. Remember, Marcus said quietly to Sarah, you're innocent, and we can prove it. Hold your head high. As the riders approached, Marcus stepped forward, projecting the same calm authority that had served him well in business negotiations. Gentlemen, he called out, I'm Marcus Sterling. I understand you're here about my wife. The federal marshal, a stern-faced man named Edwards, dismounted and approached the porch. Mr. Sterling, I have a warrant for the arrest of Sarah Sterling, also known as Sarah Mitchell, on federal charges of theft and transportation of stolen goods across state lines. I see, Marcus replied calmly. And what evidence do you have to support these charges? Marshal Edwards reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small velvet pouch. These items were recovered from a pawn shop in Denver, identified as stolen property from the home of Richard Mitchell. The shop owner has identified Mrs. Sterling as the woman who sold them. Sarah looked at the jewelry spilling from the pouch and gasped. She recognized several pieces that had belonged to her mother, items her stepfather had claimed were lost after the funeral. Those were my mother's, she said, her voice filled with pain and anger. My stepfather told me they were gone. So you admit they belong to you? Marshal Edwards asked, clearly thinking he had caught her in an admission of guilt. They belonged to my mother, Sarah corrected. My stepfather had no right to sell them, and I certainly never took them to Denver. The shop owner says otherwise. One of Hartwell's men interjected. Says you came in 3 weeks ago. Needed money quick. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Sterling was here at Silver Creek Ranch. Marcus said firmly. We have witnesses. For the next hour, Marcus presented their defense methodically. Dr. Henderson testified about his visit and his clear recollection of seeing Sarah working with the horses. Mrs. Patterson provided detailed accounts of Sarah's daily activities. Jake Morrison and 3 other ranch hands all confirmed that Sarah had never left the ranch during the time frame in question. Marshal Edwards listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the evidence mounted. Finally, he called for a private conference with his deputies, leaving Hartwell's men to glower impotently from their horses. "Mr. Sterling," the marshal said when he returned, "the evidence you've presented raises serious questions about the validity of these charges. I'm going to need to investigate further before making any arrests." "What kind of investigation?" demanded one of Hartwell's men. "The kind that involves talking to this pawn shop owner myself," Marshal Edwards replied coolly, "and examining exactly how these items came to be in his possession." As the federal men rode away, leaving Hartwell's hired guns to follow reluctantly behind, Sarah collapsed against Marcus in relief. "It's not over yet," Marcus warned, though he allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. 2 days later, Tom Bradley rode out from town with news that would change everything. Marshal Edwards had indeed spoken to the Denver pawn shop owner, who had quickly confessed under federal questioning that he had been paid to lie about when and by whom the jewelry had been sold. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that Harold Hartwell himself had arranged for the theft of the jewelry from Richard Mitchell's house, planning to use it as evidence against Sarah. The scheme involved not just perjury, but federal crimes including conspiracy and mail fraud. Within a week, Harold Hartwell and his son Thomas were under arrest, facing federal charges that would put them in prison for years. Richard Mitchell, faced with the choice between prosecution and exile, chose to leave the territory permanently, abandoning any claim to Sarah or her mother's belongings. On a warm evening in late summer, Marcus and Sarah sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The threat that had hung over them for months was finally gone, leaving them free to build the life they had discovered they both wanted. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, her hand resting in Marcus's as they shared the comfortable silence of two people perfectly at ease with each other. "Regret what?" "Marrying the most amazing woman I've ever met. Protecting the person I love from people who wanted to hurt her." Sarah smiled, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "When you put it like that, it sounds almost romantic instead of desperate." "Maybe it was both," Marcus said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Maybe the best things in life come from a combination of desperation and hope." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had run from one life in terror and desperation, only to find herself in another that was better than anything she had ever dared to dream. The secret she had begged Marcus to keep that first stormy night had become the foundation of a love story that would be told around Silver Creek Ranch for generations to come. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most beautiful beginnings came from the most frightening endings. And sometimes, when you were brave enough to trust a stranger with your darkest hour, you might just find that you had discovered your brightest future.